Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's Groundwater Sustainability Plan Workshop. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kim Loeb, Groundwater Manager with Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency, and hopefully everyone found agendas and list of acronyms and key terms with the map on back in the on the table as you walked in. If you haven't, go ahead and go back to right where you entered in. There's a table with the sign-in and those materials. If you need them, restrooms are straight out the front door there to the right, and then another right down the hall, and they'll be on your left, and there's a drinking fountain there as well. So this workshop is the fourth in a series of workshops Fox Canyon has held over the past 3 years of GSP development. Tonight's workshop will be on the GSPs for the Oxnard Subbasin and the Pleasant Valley Basin. And tomorrow night there'll be a workshop at Camarillo City Hall for the Las Posas Valley Basin. These workshops build on previous workshops that we've held over the past 3 years and the some 70-plus public meetings we've had during the development of these GSPs. This workshop, as well as the previous ones, are video recorded and are available for viewing on the defined by the Department of Water Resources, is slightly larger than Fox Canyon's jurisdictional boundary. These GSPs cover the entire groundwater basins as defined by DWR and will be managed in cooperation with our two sister groundwater sustainability agencies. So the draft GSPs, they were first uploaded to our website and available for public review on July 16th. And on July 24th, the board opened a 60-day public comment period that we're in right now. That public comment period runs through September 23rd. Tonight's focus will be on answering questions and providing clarifications to help stakeholders understand the GSPs and be able to provide meaningful comments. We have a new online comment process which we developed to help make submitting comments easier, which we'll talk about in more detail at the end of session 3, or during session 3. So our consultant, Dudek's principal technical team that developed the GSPs is here tonight, including Peter Quinlan and Ron Schnabel and Jill Weinberger, who will provide a presentation in a moment. We're also pleased to have with us tonight Anita Regmi from Department of Water Resources. And after Jill's presentation, which is our session 2 tonight, there'll be a question and answer session, so you can ask questions of the technical team and myself. And Anita from DWR will be here to also answer questions on DWR's process, and Sigma and role in evaluating and reviewing the GSPs. So at this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Jill Weinberger.
Thanks, Kim. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I should be mic'd up. Sounds like I am. As Kim said, my name is Jill Weinberger. I am with Dudek. I am one of the people on the team. Is it a little too loud? Is there feedback? No? Okay. I am one of the people on the team that's been preparing the GSPs that are now available on the Fox Canyon website, and I'm going to be talking about the material in the GSPs tonight. I am going to try my best to keep this to a relatively short presentation so that we have time to have a long enough question and answer period. As far as questions are concerned, I am happy to take clarifying questions anytime during the presentation. Don't feel shy to raise your hand, and if I've misspoken or if something's not clear, please let me know so I can address it then. But if you have broader questions on the GSP, I'd ask that you hold those until the panel discussion so that we can get the benefit of everybody's answers. But tonight, I'm going to get into what we did and what's available in the GSPs. Give just a brief background for people who haven't been involved with this process. I know many of you have been here from the beginning, but I also see a fair number of new faces, so welcome. And then I'm going to go into focusing on primarily the development of the sustainable yield for the Oxnard Subbasin and the Pleasant Valley Basin, development of the sustainable management criteria for those basins, and a discussion of the next steps in the process. So as Kim mentioned already, if there's one take-home message I can leave you with tonight, and it's only one, it is that this is a mile marker in a very long process. There's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done to date, and there's a tremendous amount of work to be done in the future. There's a 20-year period to get these basins to sustainability, and we are starting on that 20-year period by developing these GSPs. So this is a mile marker. It is not the end of the process. So with that, let's get into what's going on with the background. What's happened in the past, Kim said, Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency was formed in 1982. By 1985, the agency adopted a groundwater management plan for the basins that it oversees. By 2007, with a tremendous amount of additional work, that's a large gap, there was a lot of additional work that was done between 1985 and 2007. There was an update to the groundwater management plan, but then in 2010, California encountered the start of a historic drought. And so between 2010 and 2015, this drought was serious enough that it caught the attention of the legislature. The legislature in 2014 passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It was signed by then Governor Jerry Brown, and it went into effect in 2015. And that's the start of when the groundwater management plan needed to get replaced by a groundwater sustainability plan, a GSP. You're going to hear me use that acronym quite a lot tonight. Fox Canyon has been proactive in its approach to developing these GSPs, the groundwater sustainability plans. Starting in 2015, the agency began developing the technical background work based on the work that had already been done to develop the framework for sustainable management under the new Sustainable Groundwater Management Act system. And by 2017, the agency released preliminary draft GSPs for the basins under its jurisdiction, so that includes the Oxnard Subbasin and the Pleasant Valley Basin. At that time, the agency also solicited stakeholder feedback, held workshops, and got that feedback in the form of written comments. Those comments were reviewed and incorporated over time into what became the draft GSPs that we are here to discuss this evening. So between 2017 and 2019, stakeholder feedback was reviewed and incorporated. There was additional technical work, the development of the sustainable management criteria, and here we are in 2019 with the release of the draft GSPs. We are here to solicit additional stakeholder feedback and incorporate that feedback moving forward. But by the end of 2019, the idea is that we will have the final GSP before the board, for the board to adopt and then be submitted to DWR. So for the Pleasant Valley Basin and for the Oxnard Subbasin, those basins are required to have the GSPs submitted no later than January 31st of 2020 to DWR. So that's our hard stop. But there's a little room left on this slide because I'm going to try to drive home the point again and again and again. This is not the end of the process. The process does not end in 2019. It does not end in January of 2020. It's an ongoing process. And there's additional work that needs to be done. I'm going to discuss that later in the presentation. There will be required updates to the GSP. That's written into the legislation. There are evaluation periods that also have to be turned in to DWR. There will be revisions to this as additional work is done. and a better understanding is gained. Data gaps will be filled. So this is the start of the process. We need to get to sustainable management by 2040. This is where we're focusing tonight, and that focus is because we're talking about the GSPs and the development of the GSPs, particularly since 2017 when those preliminary drafts came out. Little bit of background on the GSPs themselves. As I said, they're required to be turned in to DWR, submitted to DWR by the end of January in 2020. They're required for Oxnard and Pleasant Valley because they are high or medium priority basins. They're high priority basins. They are also under a state of critical overdraft, which is why there is the 2020 deadline. As Kim already said, Fox Canyon is one of 3 groundwater sustainability agencies for these basins. The others are the Oxnard, Pleasant Valley Outlying Areas GSA and the Camarosa OPV GSA. The Oxnard/Pleasant Valley Outlying Areas GSA is a county GSA, County of Ventura GSA. And this is just a generalized map of what we're talking about tonight. The red and white boundary is the Fox Canyon jurisdictional boundary. The shaded colors here are the DWR basin boundaries. So purple is Oxnard subbasin, the tan is the Pleasant Valley basin. And you can see in some of the dashed lines how there are parts of the Pleasant Valley and Oxnard basins that are outside the jurisdictional boundary of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency. And so those are managed by these other GSAs. As Kim said, the draft GSP that is out for review covers the entire basin. So it does not just cover the area within Fox Canyon's jurisdiction, but it in fact covers the entire basin for Oxnard, and there's a separate GSP that covers the entire basin for the Pleasant Valley Basin. And those DWRs, I'm just gonna put a little pin to remember this in 2 slides. The DWR basin boundaries differ from the Fox Canyon boundaries based on subsurface geology. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that subsurface geology in just a minute. But to finish our discussion of the GSPs themselves, what's in the GSP? Well, it starts with an executive summary. And while it is an exceptionally well-written executive summary, I encourage you to read more than just the executive summary. There's quite a bit of background information that went into the body of these GSPs, and that information helps clarify what's up front. The executive summary is followed by the administrative information in Chapter 1. Who is the GSA? Who are the GSAs? Where are the basins? What are the boundaries? What's the climate? Those kinds of geographical questions, local questions are answered in Chapter 1. And then in Chapter 2, there's more development of the detailed basin setting. So this is looking at the hydrogeologic conceptual model, and we're going to touch on that in the next couple of slides. It's getting into the current conditions in the basin and talking about the water budget. The water budget is both the historical water budget, all 3, the historical, the current, and the projected water budget. So as we discuss the modeling runs that are done later in the presentation, that's getting into these projected water budgets. What is the water budget expected to look like between 2020 and 2070? Chapter 3 is the sustainable management criteria. We're going to talk about the sustainability goals and undesirable results, minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. You can all find a lot more detail in the GSP on those in Chapter 3. Chapter 4 goes over the monitoring network to understand what's going on in the basin moving forward. And Chapter 5 gets at the projects and management actions. And then following that, if you're still awake, there are technical appendices that go into even more detail on some of these topics. Just as it's important to understand what's in the GSP, it's also important to understand what's not in the GSP. So what's not in the GSP is an allocation plan right now. There's no allocation plan in there for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins. That is being worked on by the Fox Canyon Board. Similarly, there is no extraction reduction, right? If we're talking about reducing the amount of groundwater produced, there's no extraction reduction methodology spelled out in the GSP. That's going to be considered after the GSP is adopted, considered by the Fox Canyon Board. So to try to be even more clear, that means there are no spelled out reduction rates. There's nothing that says this is what the production has to be in 2020, 2021. But we do understand that the sustainable yield estimates that are in these GSPs are lower than the historical groundwater production rates for the basins. So the triggers for, the precise triggers for, and the timing and magnitude of extraction reductions are also going to be considered by the board following adoption of the GSP. Okay, so now I'm coming back to that placeholder I had in there for the geology, just to understand a little bit about the basin setting so you understand how the undesirable results were developed and then analyzed as part of this process. It's one of the few times geology actually matters. I'm happy to show these slides as often as I can. In the Oxnard subbasin, there are 5 aquifers. There are more hydrostratigraphic units, but there are 5 productive aquifers, and those are the Oxnard, Mugu, Hueneme, Fox Canyon, and Grimes Canyon aquifers. They are typically separated into an upper aquifer system, which is the Oxnard and Mugu aquifers, and a lower aquifer system, the Hueneme, Fox Canyon, and Grimes Canyon aquifers. So if we look at that, this upper diagram here is in fact just a map, normal map looking down. These are streets in the gray, labeled here. The black line here is a line showing the approximate location of this cross-section. And for those of you not used to looking at a cross-section, it's just like cutting into a layer cake and looking at it from the side. So now we're looking at the earth, and we're looking at the layers of the earth in the Oxnard subbasin, and we overlap into the Mound Basin just a little bit here in this cross-section. And this is showing, again, that distinction between the upper aquifer system units, shown here in these tan, light tan colors of the Oxnard and Mugu aquifers, and the lower aquifer system with the Hueneme in the orange, the Fox Canyon in the blue, and the Grimes Canyon in the purple. Similarly, when we look at a cross-section in Pleasant Valley, again, we've got a map view here, and we've got a cross-section view here, and you'll see a lot of those same colors that you saw in the previous slide. So there are 5 hydrostratigraphic units in the Pleasant Valley Basin. There's a shallow alluvial aquifer, but that's pretty limited in extent. It's just along the surface creeks and streams and along the arroyos. The older alluvium, which is here shown in this kind of light blue color, that is actually similar in age to the Oxnard and Mugu aquifers in the Oxnard subbasin. It's less productive, and that difference in production, it has more clay in it in Pleasant Valley. That difference is actually why DWR has divided these into 2 separate groundwater basins. That's the basis for the distinction, is the change in surface sediment productivity more here. The upper San Pedro, shown in this orange color, is similar in age to the Hueneme aquifer in Oxnard, but again, less productive. And then the Fox Canyon in blue and the Grimes Canyon in purple. These are the same name, same aquifer name as what's in Oxnard. And critically here, this cross-section line crosses just a little bit into the Oxnard subbasin. This little bit is represented right in here as the Oxnard subbasin, and you'll see there's actually no geologic structure separating the Pleasant Valley Basin from the Oxnard Basin. So there's not a fault that limits flow between these basins. There's not a bedrock high that limits flow between these basins. Particularly in the Fox and the Grimes Canyon Aquifer, they are continuous across that boundary. Okay? So that means that groundwater production in Pleasant Valley and groundwater levels, elevations in Pleasant Valley can influence groundwater levels and elevations in Oxnard, and vice versa. And so we see that as we plot groundwater elevation maps. This particular one on the left, I'm going to talk about a little bit more in just a second. This is groundwater elevations in 2015 in the Fox Canyon Aquifer. And we know that historically, groundwater elevations have varied in these basins. They've come up and down. They are related to groundwater production. The groundwater elevations drive the direction of groundwater flow. So as you lower the groundwater elevation in one area, if it's higher over here, water flows downhill. Groundwater elevations below sea level can create a landward gradient. They create a landward gradient from the ocean onto the land, and that can generate seawater intrusion into the aquifers. So here, if we look at the Fox Canyon Aquifer in 2015, we'll see that we have groundwater elevations, and often when we think of elevation, we're talking about positive elevation, right? That mountain is 3,000 feet high. Well, here we've got elevations below sea level. This is 140 feet below sea level, 100 feet below sea level, 60 feet below sea level. So we have groundwater elevations below sea level that can drive this gradient, landward gradient. The blue arrows here show the primary locations, approximately, of where seawater intrusion happens in these basins. It's really focused in Oxnard. It's focused in the area of the Hueneme Canyon and in Point Mugu. And then on the right, this is the plot. These are both plots that are in the GSP. And if I think I haven't said it already, I've tried on each slide to refer you to a section of the GSP where you can find this information. So you can always look for this little marker down at the bottom. So this on the right is groundwater production in the lower aquifer system in 2015. And you can obviously see more detail in the GSP, but the size and color of these dots reference the magnitude of groundwater production in the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins. So as I said, groundwater elevations below sea level can generate seawater intrusion. These are plots from the United Water Conservation District in their 2016 seawater intrusion report. They are also in the GSP, and they do not show exactly the location of seawater in the aquifers. What they show is the location of high chloride concentration in water in the aquifers. There are a couple of different ways that you can get chloride concentrations to be above background in these systems. One is seawater intrusion, right? Salt water from the ocean. Another is actually the compression or compaction of sediments that have old seawater trapped in the pore space. So that can release brines. And potentially elsewhere in parts of the basin, you can have brine migration upward along faults and things like that. You'll see on these maps that the extent of the seawater and the extent of the high chloride brine varies based on the aquifer that you're in. Generally, it's to the south of Hueneme Road and west of Highway 1. And I want to just call attention to this, the saline water impact area. That's what it's referred to as in the GSPs to address this concern about how would you separate out which component is straight seawater versus some of these other impacts that are happening in these areas. It's important to talk about seawater intrusion because what SGMA spells out quite clearly is that groundwater sustainability plans have to address undesirable results. And there are 6 sustainability indicators that are used to examine undesirable results. These are groundwater elevations, change in groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, been talking about that a lot already, groundwater quality, land subsidence, and interconnected surface water and groundwater. So in the GSP, in section 3.3, we actually spell out in even more detail than what's presented here what the undesirable results for each of these sustainability indicators would be. For groundwater elevation, because of that tie to seawater intrusion in Oxnard, the undesirable result is groundwater elevations that would result in net seawater intrusion over climate cycles of dry and wet periods, drought and recovery. For groundwater and storage, it's a volume of groundwater produced that would exceed the volume of freshwater recharge over cycles of drought and recovery. Seawater intrusion, it's an intrusion that results in a net landward, so we're talking about expansion of those areas that I showed in the last slide, making them larger, a net landward migration of that saline water impact front beyond the currently impacted area. Groundwater quality is tied to that landward migration of the saline water impact front. Subsidence is any subsidence that substantially interferes with surface land uses. These are the undesirable results. And lastly, interconnected surface water and groundwater. You can see that in streams sometimes. That would be a loss of groundwater-dependent ecosystem habitat, GDEs. Probably won't use the phrase GDE very often, but in case I do, it's groundwater-dependent ecosystem. For Pleasant Valley, there's a little bit of a change because Pleasant Valley, although those water levels interact with the water levels in Oxnard and the two influence each other, there is no direct seawater intrusion into the Pleasant Valley Basin. We've done modeling and particle tracks. There's no expectation that under any scenarios of modeling that seawater itself would extend inland enough to physically impact the Pleasant Valley Basin. But the Pleasant Valley Basin and groundwater elevations in Pleasant Valley can impact the ability of Oxnard to be able to eliminate that undesirable result. So here are the undesirable results for Pleasant Valley. They are groundwater levels that do not recover to pre-drought conditions during multi-year periods of above average precipitation, right? So if you're in a really wet cycle, but your groundwater elevations are still down, then you haven't allowed that groundwater to recover with the climate. So that's a sign that that's an undesirable result. Also, groundwater levels that would prevent the Oxnard subbasin from stopping landward migration of that saline water impact front. It's an undesirable result. And any measurable increase in brine migration along faults in the Pleasant Valley Basin is defined as an undesirable result related to groundwater elevation. Groundwater and storage is the same. It's that volume of groundwater volume of groundwater produced exceeds the recharge over cycles of drought and recovery. Seawater intrusion, it's not applicable directly to the Pleasant Valley Basin. It's applicable in the sense of the interaction between the two, but not directly to Pleasant Valley. Groundwater quality is a groundwater gradient that would cause expansion of currently impacted areas for water quality. Subsidence is the same. It's any subsidence that would substantially interfere with surface land uses. And the interconnected surface water and groundwater is the same. It's a loss of groundwater-dependent ecosystem habitat. There's so much more information on each of these things and how they were developed in the GSPs, so I encourage you to read that or to ask us questions about them at the end of this presentation. But in order to assess the potential impacts on all of these sustainability indicators and understand undesirable results, you really need a tool that looks at these basins as a whole, and that tool is a numerical groundwater model. So for this effort, we use the United Water Conservation District model for Oxnard Pleasant Valley. It also covers the West Los Posas management area. And the model was used to investigate production rates that would mitigate undesirable results, starting with the assumption that let's see what happens if the 2015 to 2017 average production rate is continued into the future. That was the baseline model run. It was the starting assumption to see if there would be any undesirable results under that scenario. There are a few required model scenarios, and then there were some additional scenarios that were run as part of this. The required ones are to assess the future baseline. So that's what I was just saying. Continuing production at the average 2015 to 2017 production rates for the next 50 years. Also looking at what the sustainable yield might be if that determined that there were undesirable results. And it did. What would the sustainable yield be if we didn't incorporate projects? And what would it be if we did incorporate projects? The sustainable yield in this context is the production rate at which undesirable results are avoided. So those were estimated for the aquifer systems, the upper aquifer system and lower aquifer system. They were not estimated for each aquifer individually. And then the last important point here is that so we actually ran 6 model scenarios, and I'm going to talk about those on the next slide, but no individual model scenario was used to recommend a specific way of managing the basins. The model scenarios were analyzed as a group to understand what the sustainable yield would be. So the sustainable yield does not come from just a single model scenario, it comes from the group of scenarios that were run. And I'll describe that in a second as well. So here are those 6 scenarios, that baseline, 2015 to 2017 production, a future baseline with projects. These were the projects that were incorporated. In order for the projects to be incorporated, they were submitted by stakeholders. They had to meet DWR's criteria for inclusion in the GSP, and they were approved by the Fox Canyon board for analysis as part of this GSP process. That doesn't mean that the projects were approved to occur in the future. It was just to be analyzed as part of this process. So some of these projects may be adopted, some of them may not be, maybe all of them are, and maybe none of them are. It was just to see what the impacts of these potential projects would be. There was then a scenario where groundwater, so let me back up. Future baseline had that 2015 to 2017 average production rate. So did the baseline with projects scenario. The only difference was you added in the projects. Then there was a scenario that we did where pumping was reduced, but we still had the projects. And then there were 3 scenarios that were run where pumping was reduced and the projects were not incorporated. So the projects, the potential projects, are fallowing of land in Pleasant Valley, which would have generated an additional 2,200 acre-feet a year of reduced pumping, 500 acre-feet a year in the Oxnard subbasin. There's 4,600 acre-feet a year of water from the Great project in the Oxnard Basin, and in West Las Posas, because this model covers the West Las Posas Basin as well, or the West Las Posas Management Area as well. There was also an in lieu delivery of 1,800 acre-feet a year. So those were the projects. I talked about the 2015 to 2017 rates. So to put the next slide in context, where I'm going to talk about the sustainable yield, we need to understand what the 2015 to 2017 rates were, and they are shown here. So in the upper aquifer system, 2015 to 2017 average production rate was 39,000 acre-feet per year. In the lower aquifer system, it's 29,000 acre-feet per year, and those are in the Oxnard subbasin. In Pleasant Valley, the 2015-2017 average rate was 14,000 acre-feet a year, and the same is true for the West Las Posas Management Area. The scenarios that did incorporate reduced production did it in a way that was a gradual, linear ramp down over the 20-year period. So each year, an additional reduction was taken to get from point A, the 2015 to 2017 rates, to the reduced rate. As I said before, these projects are not the only ones that can be undertaken, and some might not be. And so what I think you're going to see as part of this, as part of the ongoing work to be done, is that really there's going to need to be a review of the projects and how we optimize management of the basin to examine ways that the sustainable yield can be increased. So, having said that, what were the estimated sustainable yields? What are they in the GSP? They are spelled out here, and I will speak to the actual numbers in just a second. But to tell you or give you an example of how we got there, this gets to how I was saying no individual model run was used, but all 6 of these scenarios were used. The model scenarios are shown as the blue dots, and here we're plotting groundwater production in each of those model scenarios on the x-axis. So here's the baseline and baseline with projects. They have the highest production. And on the y-axis, we're plotting seawater flux. In this case, positive flux here is seawater going into the basin. Negative flux is groundwater going out of the basin. This is just an example for the upper aquifer system. I don't have this for every single one, but this is to give you a sense of how these were done. And so if you look at where there is no net seawater flux and you look at the production rate in the upper aquifer system, you come right in here to about 32,000 acre feet per year. In addition to that, there was a significant work done to develop uncertainty because models have uncertainty. All models have uncertainty in them. So when you look at quantifying the uncertainty in these estimates, you come up with plus or minus 4,000 to 6,000 acre feet a year as the uncertainty in this estimate. So start with the upper aquifer system. 2015 to 2017 rate was 39,000 acre feet a year. If the upper end of the uncertainty is used here, you're at 38,000 acre feet a year. If you look at the lower aquifer system, the story is a little bit different. 2015 to 2017, the production was 29,000 acre feet a year. Upper end of the uncertainty, more like 10 or 11,000 acre feet a year. Pleasant Valley, 2015 to 2017 rate was 14,000 acre feet a year. The upper end of the uncertainty, we're at 12,600. So it varies, the difference between what was happening in 2015 to 2017 and what's predicted as the estimated sustainable yield with all of the projects that were incorporated and the cautions that I gave about those. The difference between those numbers varies with aquifer system and it varies with geographic location. We can't manage the basin simply by reporting pumping and reporting pumping to the sustainable yield. So under Sigma, the way to manage the basins is in fact to define thresholds at which undesirable results would occur. These are in fact the minimum thresholds. These are just an example for wells screened within the Fox Canyon aquifer. And I've just blown up, it's the same number here, but it's just bigger. So that's the well number. And the number here, 7 in this case, is the feet above mean sea level that would be required as the minimum threshold for that well in the GSP. Minimum thresholds are static water levels, so they're not pumping water levels. They're when the water level's recovered. They've been selected for key wells. These are the key wells in the Fox Canyon aquifer. They are not applied to every single well in the basin, just these select list of key wells. And for these basins, the minimum thresholds are based on the lowest water level for Oxnard from which the basin will recover without causing net landward migration of that saline water intrusion front. And also for parts of Pleasant Valley, the water level from which the basin will recover without causing long-term declines over cycles of drought and recovery. They are above the historical low water levels in this slide in all but one of the wells. So historically, water levels have been lower than the proposed minimum thresholds. This slide's really busy, but it's to try to give you a sense of the difference between the historical low water level and the minimum threshold. Minimum threshold is higher, as well as the difference between the spring 2015 water level and the minimum threshold. So the difference in the spring 2015 levels is shown in the inner circle here. The size and color of the circle is related to the size of the difference in water levels, the magnitude of that difference. So for instance, in this well up here, it had a minimum threshold of 7 feet mean sea level. That is 36 feet higher than the spring water level in 2015, and it's 57 feet higher than the historical low water level. So that's what all of these are showing. You can see along the coast, we've got water level differences in the order of 20 to 60 feet, except down here, we've got 90 feet. They're larger inland. And the one exception, the one well where in fact the spring water level is higher than the minimum threshold is in Pleasant Valley. That's this green circle here. Spring water level is 173 feet higher than the minimum threshold in that well. But in fact, the historical water level has been below the minimum threshold in that well. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But the minimum threshold is the level that you are mandated to meet under your GSP?
The minimum threshold is the threshold level. I'm pausing here because there's a second step to this process. But if you only had one well in your basin, the minimum threshold would be the water level at which you would say below which you would say undesirable results occur. Now, we have more than one well, and so in a couple slides, you're actually going to see that you define basin-wide undesirable results by the number of wells that are below a minimum threshold, but it's indicating where undesirable results will begin to occur, is what the minimum threshold is. Did that help?
So it's not, I mean, as far as goals, it's a meaningless number?
So the question is it meaningless as far as goals? No, it's not. It's the way that the basin will be evaluated for whether or not it's reached sustainability. So we're not reporting pumping, you're reporting water levels in this case. So the water levels by 2040 need to be above those minimum thresholds.
Before you leave that,
Yeah.
could you just go over the green circle again?
Oh yeah. So in the Pleasant Valley Basin, at this one well, the water level is actually currently higher than the minimum threshold. And that's the only well for that is true in this slide. Additionally, there are measurable objectives. So these water levels are higher than the minimum threshold, and they are the target water levels that you would like to manage your basin towards, with the understanding that here in California we do have cycles of drought. And so if you have managed your basin towards the measurable objectives, and in fact in these basins sometimes water levels will be higher than the measurable objectives, when you get to the measurable objective, when a water level reaches that elevation, there is still some time for it to decline during a period of drought when groundwater extractions may need to be increased, before it hits the minimum threshold, before it triggers an undesirable result in the basin. So the measurable objectives are higher. And here, they're still static water levels. They're still selected at the same set of key wells. We're sticking with this Fox Canyon example. So here you saw, if I can get the cursor, over in my favorite well in the corner here, the minimum threshold was 7. The measurable objective is 22 feet above mean sea level. They are based on the water level at which there is no net seawater flux into or out of these aquifers. So during wet periods, you may in fact have groundwater flowing out to the ocean. During dry periods, there may be seawater flowing into the basin. We just need to stop the net landward migration of that saline water impact front. They are similar to an average water level in the basins over time. This is the same diagram. The circles are bigger because the water levels are higher, but it's giving the same information. And I want to come back to this idea of how will the basins be managed. So this is the only hydrograph I'm going to show tonight for those of you who have been bored by several of these in the past. This is the only one. So this is the historical groundwater elevation in this well in the Oxnard subbasin. And these are two of the model projection runs. So the minimum threshold here is in the red. It's the lower groundwater elevation. The measurable objective is in the blue, and it's the higher elevation. As the agency reports groundwater elevations to DWR, DWR is going to be evaluating where they are in this range. And you'll see that over the model period, there are times when groundwater elevations should be and are higher than the measurable objective to make this balance out. I'm going to come back to that point that I made pretty early on, saying this is eventually the kind of information that will be used to establish triggers for groundwater extraction reductions. But we're not there yet. That hasn't been set yet. So the specific reduction method will be considered by the board after GSP adoption. Lastly, in this process, because we have groundwater elevations that are below the minimum threshold right now and below the measurable objective, you've got to set targets to get there over the next 20 years. And there are a couple of different paths to getting there. One is just looking at dry climate conditions. One is looking at average climate conditions, but of course you can have anything in between, and you can have wetter than average climate conditions. It's important to look at this because we've set these interim thresholds as a way for DWR to also communicate with the agency about how well the agency is doing in getting towards sustainability by 2040. So the target here, if we have average conditions, would be to come up towards the measurable objective by the end of that 20-year period. And I apologize, the axis is up here, but this would be 2020 to 2040. So every 5 years, there's an interim milestone that's set. However, if we have drier than average conditions, it's going to be hard to make it to that measurable objective, so you might only make it up to the minimum threshold. So the GSP does talk about the methodology for evaluating whether or not the interim milestone has been met and reevaluating that every 5 years. And this last slide gets back to the if you only had one well in your basin comment, right? We don't have one well in the basin. We have multiple wells in the basin. We have multiple key wells in the basin. And so there are, in fact, a larger set of criteria that are used to assess whether the basin as a whole is experiencing undesirable results. It's not triggered by one water level in one well being measured below the minimum threshold. What it would be evaluated using in the upper aquifer system is if 6 of the 15 key wells are below the minimum threshold, that's sufficient to say the upper aquifer system in the Oxnard subbasin is experiencing an undesirable result. If any of the key wells is below the historical low, that is also an undesirable result. That historical low, for the most part in Oxnard, is lower than the 2015 water levels. So you've gone down from where you started. And then also, if any of the key wells is below the minimum threshold for 3 consecutive monitoring periods, so that would be over a year and a half, or for 3 of 5 consecutive monitoring periods. And so that would be to say that you can't have a basin in which one well is always below the minimum threshold. Something's wrong there. So this is an example from the upper aquifer system. And I apologize that this is a little hard to see, but in many of these circles, there are actually 2 or 3 wells. And that's because the upper aquifer system has both the Oxnard and the Magoo aquifers. And so we have measuring points separated out between the aquifers within the aquifer system. But if we say that these red circles, for an example, are the wells that are below the minimum threshold, you'd have 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now you've hit 6 of 15, 7, 8, 9. If 9 wells are below the minimum threshold, the basin would be determined to be experiencing undesirable results. In the lower aquifer system for Oxnard, it's very similar. It's if 8 of 19 key wells were below the minimum threshold. Again, if any of those wells is below the historical low, or if the timing of them so that they're below for 3 consecutive or 3 of 5 consecutive monitoring events. And lastly, in Pleasant Valley, we don't have the same well coverage there, so it's not defined by aquifer or aquifer system. It's for the basin as a whole. If 4 of the 9 key wells in the Pleasant Valley Basin are below the minimum threshold, that would be significant to say that the basin is experiencing a basin-wide undesirable result. And the same with the below the historical low and the timing for the low water levels. I brought it up before. I'm really close to wrapping this up, I promise. This is the start of a much longer process. Mandated in the regulations is at a minimum a reevaluation of the GSP every 5 years. It's not voluntary. It's part of what has to happen to manage these basins. So you can imagine that as data gaps are filled, as projects are brought forward that are different from the ones that were proposed for this initial step of the process, the minimum thresholds, measurable objectives will be reevaluated as part of that. And ultimately, the basin management needs to be optimized, looking at these new projects, potentially changing the location of groundwater production, moving water around the basins, and implementation of additional projects. This is a visual that tells the same thing. I started with a line. I can't fit all of this in a line, so we got to go on a winding path now. But this is where we are in the process. So the comment period for the GSPs opened on, the draft GSPs opened on July 23rd. It will close on September 23rd. I can't bring this up anymore, but you can read it. Between September and November, DUDEC will be busy reviewing and incorporating stakeholder feedback and presenting to the board an overview of the comments that were received. By the end of November, these dates are preliminary. The farther out you get, there's a little asterisk there to indicate that, but by the end of November, we anticipate releasing final GSP to be reviewed by the board and adopted December 13th at the end of this year. After that, the final GSP will be submitted to DWR, at which point DWR will also have a 60-day public comment period. So there's an additional comment period as part of that process. I don't know the exact timing of that, but after the 60-day public comment period closes for DWR, which is dependent on when the GSP is submitted, DWR will begin its evaluation. DWR has, I believe, 2 years to evaluate the GSPs, but during that time, we can't put on the brakes. The idea is to manage under the GSPs until we hear from DWR and then incorporate DWR's suggestions as we go from there. So during that 2-year period, they're going to begin the evaluation in February-ish of 2020. They have to have it completed by 2022, but there will be annual reports that are required to be submitted to DWR. There will also be ongoing planning and optimization, talking about many of the same things we've been talking about. The annual reports will continue, DWR's feedback will be incorporated, and by 2025, that mandatory 5-year evaluation is due to DWR. So that's where we are in the process. I know there are going to be a lot of questions. Before we get to those, I think I'm going to give it to Zoe for just a minute to talk, although I think it's frozen. Maybe that's why I can't. Zoe's going to talk about the online comment submission process, if we can advance the slide.
So, hi, I'm Zoe Carlson. I'm also on the DUDEC team. And we did take a look at the comment process that we used last time and thought there might be some opportunity to improve it for this next GSP. So we developed an online comment form that is available on, oh, there it is. Okay. It's available on the Fox Canyon website where you download the groundwater sustainability plan. On the website right below that, there's a link that'll take you directly to this comment form, and you can submit the comments directly online. We do require that you include your first and last name, as well as your email. The email will allow us to send you an automatic confirmation, so you have a record of the comments that you submitted. You can make sure that it says what you wanted it to. Of course, you can let us know if it doesn't. There's also an option of including your address. If you would like to give us a little bit more information about what you're interested in the basin, but that is optional. Just wanted to highlight that your personal information will remain confidential. We're not going to release that to the public. However, your name and the comment will be part of the public record. And this is moving down on the comment form. Couldn't fit it all on one slide. You can submit, there's a drop-down menu. You can actually select a chapter and specific section of the GSP to comment on. This will help us to understand and address your comment because we'll know which specific chapter you're referencing. And I believe I forgot to mention on the last slide, there is a separate form for each of the groundwater sustainability plans. If you don't want to comment on specific sections, I know sometimes agencies like to put together a formal letter. You can get rid of this comment field and instead upload an attachment of a letter or consolidated comments. Again, we do encourage you to submit individual comments on the specific chapters to help us better understand and address your comments. And then there's also some information about additional optional stakeholder information, again, just to help us better understand where you're coming from. If you'd like to include that, that'd be great. But again, that is optional. There's also the email address listed at the bottom of the comment form if you have questions about the GSPs or about the comment form. You can always email the email address that's included on the form, as well as on the agenda today. We can always accept comments and questions through that email address. Questions about the comment form quickly? Okay, all right. So as both Kim and Jill mentioned, our focus today will really be getting your questions answered and providing clarification because we do have this online comment tool. If you do want to provide comments here today, you can do that, but again, we want to have the emphasis on clarifying what's in the GSPs. And in order to help with that process, since we are talking about 2 groundwater sustainability plans today, I'm going to pass the microphone around if you want to state your name and which basin you're in or which groundwater sustainability plan you are providing a question or comment on. That will help us out. So if you would like to raise your hand, I'll bring over the microphone.
Get to be the guinea pig. Diana Engel, and my question, I have a couple questions for Jill, but they're common to both of the basins. So one question I have is on the model, when you applied reductions in pumping, was that just sort of a monotonic spread over all cells of the model? How did you pull the water out of the bathtub, so to speak, in the modeling step?
I appreciate that you think that I actually did the modeling, but I'm going to pass this question to
Okay.
Peter
Anyway,
to answer. I think he can answer it better than I can.
And I also didn't do the modeling. Jason's son back there did. But the model simulates the individual wells.
so every well had the
Every
same
well,
amount reduction,
Yes, the same percentage reduction.
percent reduction?
So it was, in all of these, there was uniform reductions for all the wells. The
Okay.
only difference being that some wells, if water is being delivered, surface water is being delivered, then that reduction would be a little different. The uniform reduction in the upper aquifer system is different than the uniform reduction in the lower aquifer system in Oxnard.
Okay, I think that helps. And so the other question I have, it relates to that slide where you showed how you drew a line with a particular slope and then it intersects the zero net seawater intrusion. So what I'm wondering is, isn't the slope of that line completely dependent on the volume reduction of pumping you decided to model? So you could have any number of lines with any number of slopes, conceivably, that would intersect that zero line at all different kinds of places on the x-axis?
I'm going to take a stab at this, but I'm going to ask other people to help clarify it if I go astray. It is dependent on the relationship between groundwater production and seawater flux in the scenarios that we modeled. So if there were additional scenarios that fell way outside of that line, then conceivably the slope of that line would change. But based on the 6 scenarios that were run, that line is really dependent on the best fit between the relationship between groundwater production and seawater flux.
I guess what I'm saying is that the line is anchored by the leftmost 2 scenarios, reduction without projects, reduction without projects number 2. So I guess that the amount of reduction, that could have leveraged the line up or down, unless I'm misunderstanding the approach.
Well, the amount of reduction is actually represented by the location along the x-axis. So the x-axis there is groundwater production.
Right,
So
I
what
get
we're-
that.
So we're looking at there is the modeled groundwater production in each of those 6 scenarios, and that's what determines how far to the left or right those scenarios are. So with additional reductions, there is still a relationship between production and seawater intrusion.
So you're
seawater
saying they would
flux.
more or less fall on a linear relationship as best you can tell right now?
As best we can tell from the 6 that were
Okay.
conducted.
That's helpful, thank you.
Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Good evening. My name is Chris Ross from the Tri-County Sentry, and I'm new to this, so I'm learning, so work with me here. I was reading through the executive summary, and in the executive summary, I was seeing that there's some issue with seawater intrusion that's directly related to Point Mugu and the naval base actions. If that is in fact true, do you expect to hold the Navy responsible for that? And how do you expect to get anything back from them?
I'm going to start with the technical part of that, and then I think Kim will follow up. So the executive summary, I think, discusses the geology and the geological aspect of where seawater intrusion is occurring. It's not intended to point the finger at the Navy or any operations on the naval base. It just happens to coincide with the Point Mugu happens to coincide with the location of a submarine canyon. And because of the geologic implications of having this submarine canyon be really close to shore, groundwater production onshore can be drawn in through the walls of the canyon. So it's not tied to operations at the base, it's tied to the geology.
Okay, but if it wasn't happening,
Sorry.
if it wasn't happening, you wouldn't be having this problem, right?
Well, the submarine canyon there, where the aquifer is actually crops out into the ocean and the seawater can come in at the Magoo and the Wainimi under submarine canyons, whether the Navy base was there or not, that geology, those would be there. And so it's the pumping across the basin that is bringing the groundwater levels less than seawater elevation, and then the seawater comes in. So that would be occurring whether or not the base was at that location.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want, I'm Amanda Fagan, I'm with Naval Base Ventura County, and I just want to clarify that we actually don't pump at Point Magoo. We haven't pumped since the mid-90s because of seawater intrusion that was occurring up gradient of the naval installation. So our actions in terms of pumping or anything else are not influencing this relationship of the groundwater. We're affected by pumping that occurs around the installation, but not on it. Questions? Yes.
Yes, so I'm Rosemary Gaglione. I'm Public Works Director, City of Oxnard. The GSP speaks to the fact that the groundwater levels in the Oxnard Basin, they cycle along with the climate. But we seem to be stuck in 2015, and the GSP is silent on all of the rains we've had. We just bought, I think it was, I could be wrong, but 15,000 acre feet of Article 21 water. Even in Section 2-58, it says, or page 2-58, it says current, parentheses, 2015 groundwater conditions. That's not current. And this is going to be submitted and published in 2020. And it seems to paint a more dire picture than that is. If that creates the more of a reduction in pumping that creates by staying in this scenario, that means us purchasing more water, imported water, which is more expensive, which would have an impact on our ratepayers. Also, it spooks developers in the future. I mean, it just seems like these recent events should be included in this report.
So the reason the GSP references 2015 and everything's based on 2015 is because the Sigma Act itself set 2015 as the baseline year as well as the GSP emergency regulations. So we have to look at 2015 as the baseline year. We can't look at a later year. We could choose to look at an earlier year, but 2015 is the latest year that we can set as the baseline year according to the Act and the regulations. So that's why everything is tied to 2015.
So you can't just discuss that the basin the conditions are improving?
Well, so I think I'm going to add just to what Kim said is that, first of all, there will be these annual updates. So, and these will be coming out very soon. So more current conditions will be addressed in that. However, I want to again point to the relationship between groundwater production and seawater intrusion or seawater flux as really driving how the sustainable yield was developed. So it's a little separate. The water levels are used as a gauge of where the basin is. And you're right that if water levels have recovered, then those giant circle plots that I showed would get smaller relative to the 2015. But the sustainable yield wasn't developed based on the water levels. It was based on that relationship between groundwater production and seawater intrusion.
Hi, and it's not just based on 2015. So the future scenarios include 50 years of climate. In working with the technical advisory group, we picked two 50-year periods from the past, and the climate was adjusted based on instructions from DWR. So most of these simulations were done using 1930 to 1979 and making that 2020 to 2069. Yeah. And 2015 is the starting water level for those simulations. But it starts with some wet period. I think that one hydrograph we showed water levels going up because it was a pretty wet period. Then we get into a drought and it levels out and goes down a bit, and then it ends in a wet period again. So it's not just 2015 conditions.
Hi, Tien with the City of Oxnard. Can you go back to the slide, talk about sustainable yield chart? Yeah, I'm having trouble understanding that dash line. So the way that I heard you folks explain is that basically that dash line represents that under this options or scenario, basically is we're going to do the similar pumping to 2015, 2017 with no inclusions of projects. And if we have to do that, that would be what shows that. I'm having understanding what those lines and the relationship of those reductions, projects 1 and 2, and I don't see the weather pattern being discussed here. What model did you use, and did you start it out with a drier pattern or wet?
Let me start with the weather pattern. We used historical climate from 1930 to 1979, adjusted for future climatic conditions. So it starts with a wet period, a few wetter years, and goes into a drought, and then it ends on with wet years again. So that's the climatic period. What this is showing is, and so every one of these dots represents the amount, the average seawater intrusion over that 50-year period for the pumping rate in the scenario. So for the upper right-hand corner, you have the baseline dot. That is holding the 2015, 2017 average pumping rates constant, allowing for deliveries of surface water to modify them somewhat, through the whole 50-year period. And that results in an average of net seawater intrusion of approximately 4,400 acre-feet per year. So then we just plot the average seawater flux against the average pumping rate to create on this graph, and then do a linear regression among the 6 points to derive that diagonal line. Using the diagonal line, we look at the y-axis to see where there's no net seawater intrusion to find an interpolated pumping rate, which would result in no net seawater intrusion, and you drop to the bottom, and it's 32,000 acre-feet a year approximately.
And just to finish that off, the dashed upper vertical part of that line is just to show where that 32,000 projects, because the gray area is the uncertainty, right? So that's plus 6,000 minus 6,000 around that central point.
Hi, Terry Foreman with Camarosa Water District. I think there needs to be clarification on the use of that 2015 to 27 average pumping. that number isn't really what's used for the baseline. The 2017 or 2015 to 2017 pumping for Oxnard, Pleasant Valley, West Las Posas is 108,294 acre feet a year. But that's really used to set the capacity of available pumping, as I understand it. And that then is the total amount of water that's assumed to be available throughout the base period, but then fluctuates based on available surface water. So the pumping actually varies considerably depending upon how much surface water is available. So when you look at the baseline actual pumping amounts, which come out of the model, those are very different. And so you get, if you were to just take 2015 to 2017 pumping, you'd get that 108,294 acre feet. But if you then look at the baseline pumping and the values that are reported in the GSP, they don't add up to that. And that's because of the surface water that fluctuates highly for the future. And so I think in order for everyone to really understand what the variation in pumping is, you need to say that the baseline pumping is used as just that, the baseline pumping. It's not the 2015 to 2017. The actual baseline varies depending upon how much surface water is available. And so the cuts really are based on the amount of groundwater and surface water. So it's applied to the total water, not just to pumping. And that drove me nuts for about the last 6 months until I got that explained to me the other day to clarify. And so I think if someone were to go through and they were to take GMA's database and get those numbers and get the 108,294 acre feet, they wouldn't compare to what's being said in the GSP, which is really the baseline numbers that varied as a result of the available surface water over the 50-year period. So it would be helpful to clarify that in the GSP so we know what we're actually talking about. And then the other is the discussion of surface water and availability of surface water over that period to understand what the total water is available. You did that in the previous memos in, what was it, January, whatever it was. So it's kind of helpful to see what the total supply is.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I believe it would be useful to have the total water. With respect to your comment, it is the baseline for a drought year. So I think, the pumping fluctuates on wet versus wet years and dry years on the availability of surface water to be delivered. And in a dry year, it is the pump, I believe, again, Jason, it's very intricate, and United worked it out, that if there's surface water available, there's less groundwater pumping. But that 2015, 2017 pumping rate is for the dry years when there's no surface water available to be delivered.
But it's described as the baseline pumping, but baseline really becomes much less when you take it over 50 years.
Yeah, I think if we put in total water and we do things like include, when you look at some of the scenarios, there's a pumping rate, but it doesn't reflect that people are being paid to fallow 2,500 acres, or the equivalent of 2,500 acre feet per year. It doesn't show that there's an in-lieu delivery of a net, 2,600 acre feet from the GREAT project. Those numbers probably should be added in to show the total water that's being made available through this.
Hi, Leslie Purcell. I'm interested in the Oxnard area aquifer. So apparently there's possible contamination in that aquifer from oil-related activity. The USGS report, I think, raised that issue recently, and I'm just wondering, do you consider contaminants in the groundwater as part of your studies, other than the saline content?
We reviewed information that's in the regional board online files and the DTSC files, and looking at contamination, not primarily from manufacturing activities at the surface. And that is primarily exclusively in the semi-perch zone in Oxnard. There's very little that gets into the Oxnard aquifer itself. It's that uppermost clay and silty aquifer that is already salty that no one is using. So we did not identify, in looking at the regional board files, plumes of solvents or gas station releases that had made it to the Oxnard. We, at the time we reviewed this, did not see anything about, you're talking about brines and drilling fluids coming up from below the aquifer systems?
I'm not clear exactly where they're coming from, but apparently there were some traces identified such that the Board of Supervisors, asked for further study on that.
We reviewed the water quality sampling provided by all the municipal supply wells, which are under the Office of Drinking Water and have to report, and those did not, there was no contaminants detected in those above MCLs that we saw. But we can take a look at this.
I'm going to go before Terry goes again. Brian Bondi, tag member. My question is about the Pleasant Valley sustainable yield, 11,600. The modeling included simulation of the North Pleasant Valley desalter, which was going to bring in 4,500 acre feet of pumping. My question is the 11,600 sustainable yield inclusive of the 4,500 project pumping, or is this the sustainable yield and the pumping of the project would be in addition to that?
The model included, so in this case it does, that pumping goes from 2020 to 2045 and is not part of the, there's no pumping after 2045 in the model, as I recall.
So is the 11,600 sustainable yield include the project pumping or not? In other words, is there 11,600 to be pumped by everybody other than the project, or is there 11,600 minus 4,500, whatever that math is, 7,100?
Page 131.
The sustainable yield is based, is based on the relationship that I've described for all of the scenarios. And so that pumping is included in some of the scenarios. It's not as simple as saying it's 11,600 minus 4,500 acre feet a year for the first 20 years. It's an average looking at all of the model scenarios. But in some of those model scenarios, yes, that pumping is included.
Good evening. My name is Robert Arani. I'm with Fox Canyon GMA. My question has to do with on page 1-9 in regards to cost estimates, and then also table 1.2 that you have on page 147. It shows that the estimated cost for this project or this plan is about $3 million a year. What it doesn't state is that specific to the Oxnard or Pleasant Valley Basin, or is that divided across all three plans? And if it is across all three plans, shouldn't it be broken out specifically for each basin and each plan? Or are we looking at now $9 to $12 million that we're going to have to come up with in order to implement these?
Yeah, we debated that very point. It is for all three plans. So the same table is in each of the GSPs. That's the cost for all three plans.
Sorry.
So this is sort of cost related, so we'll tie into what Robert just said. In your plan, you list the data gaps and the necessary things that you would like to see done before the 5-year review. Monitoring wells, studies on the groundwater-dependent ecosystem, pressure transducers, et cetera, et cetera. Are you going to prioritize those? Because when I look at the cost in Table 1-1, I'm looking at the Pleasant Valley report now. It shows, the project, which the one and only project is falling farmland at $1,800 an acre foot. And then it shows the operation and monitoring costs, management, administration, and other costs. And the total is just, to me, astronomical. So if you take the project cost and the cost you want to do for these updated studies that you need for the 5-year update, I'm concerned about assessment fees and what that's going to do to my farmers. So that's the first question I have.
So to address that, I'm actually going to start and then pass it to Kim in case he has more insight on this, which I'm sure he will. The filling of the data gaps and assigning pressure transducers and drilling of wells, that has not been prioritized yet. That's all part of what's to come. And I'm sure there will be, I assume there will be recommendations made to the board about how to prioritize that as funding becomes available, and those are explored. But they have not been prioritized yet.
So, as of actually right now, through a DWR program, which we applied for that's funded through DWR, a nested monitoring well is being installed in the North Pleasant Valley Basin that will provide monitoring points in every aquifer, and also then moving to Oxnard, and will pick up 3 of the aquifers, and then we're hopeful that DWR will come back and will be successful in getting them to come back and complete the deeper ones as well. So we're already starting to aggressively pursue available grant funding. This is through the DWR Technical Support Services Program, where it's actually turnkey with DWR's drilling contractor that comes out and does the work. So we will be continue aggressively try and find opportunities to grant opportunities or support to get those critical monitoring facilities installed. But in terms of the projects that we have, I think we've talked before, I think you've been part of it, but probably not everybody. We had to identify projects for these initial GSPs that were developed enough to meet the feasibility criteria that are in the GSP regulations, and then we had to cost estimate them. What we plan to do once the GSP is adopted, this is a starting point, then we will be working, the next step will be large-scale regional evaluation, feasibility studies, optimization studies as to what projects are going to get us to sustainability in the long run over the 20-year period, and what is that going to cost, and what are the key monitoring facilities, because yes, they are expensive, but as we get more information and more specific information, specific aquifers, that may give us a lot more flexibility in how we operate the basin so we can pump more, and so they may well show that they're well worth the investment to the stakeholder group. But there's a lot of work to be done following adoption of the GSP to develop the path for the long-term 20-year journey we have to get to sustainability. And those projects at the end of 20 years may look quite a bit different than what we have now.
And I appreciate that, but when I'm looking at a $79 million number, and I take it this is for all three basins,
Right.
and that is just on reporting and administration, that has not one project dollar penny in it, I'm concerned it's not financially sustainable. That's my concern. And then, and I'm sure we'll address that as we go through this process. But the other question I had to do with, Deanne was talking about climate change, the climate period and how that was arrived. So I'm assuming that the projections are the numbers that came from the state on precipitation. Is there anything in the appendixes that shows how that methodology for calculating that was done at the state level?
So the first part of that, and let me do the second part first. No, there's no appendix that refers to the state methodology for determining the climate change factors. Those are publicly available documents, but they're not included as an appendix to the GSPs. The first part of the question, as Peter was describing, there were two climate periods. One is that 1930 to 1969, and then an additional climate period was evaluated to look at how precipitation patterns and how selection of precipitation patterns might influence the overall water levels in the basin. But those for instance, if we're just looking at precipitation, which is one factor, the precipitation for each year, each of those 50 years, and in fact, each month in those 50 years was adjusted based on a number that is slightly above 1, slightly below 1, provided by DWR. So that's how climate change was incorporated. So if, for instance, you had a January of 1930 that had 10 inches of rain, and DWR's climate change adjustment suggested that January, if you assign that to January of 2020, and you look at it's a little different than that, but if you look at 2030 climate conditions from DWR, you multiply that by 0.9. This is just an example, it's made up, it's not real. But if you had 10 inches of rain and you had to multiply it by 0.9, now you got 9 inches of rain, right? So that's the adjustment that was made to go into the modeling for precipitation. And it was done monthly.
Yeah, I do want to make sure that everybody who has questions gets to ask them.
Sherry Klima from the city of Oxnard. And I just want to know what's, I know that there are different salinity factors that you all mentioned outside of just seawater intrusion. How do you differentiate between what is caused by seawater intrusion versus what is caused by other seawater factors or salinity factors?
So the USGS has investigated that at some level, looking at isotopic compositional differences in the groundwater. For the purposes of the GSP, what we're really concerned with is the relationship between groundwater elevation and salinity. Because GSPs have to address groundwater quality independent of seawater intrusion. So if groundwater elevations cause the compaction of these aquifers, or not aquifers, cause the compaction of these clay units that have high salinity, that is also a concern under the GSP. So we're not actively trying to differentiate those two right now. It's really looking at the relationship between groundwater elevation and water quality.
Hello, Bert Perello, an Oxnard City Councilman. I have a question with respect to your Oxnard proposal. The page 8 and 9 of your proposal, number 1, 3, and 5 of the corrective actions indicate the GREAT program. I've just verified it with my staff. $57 million has been promised and being paid for by the residents of Oxnard. What will be the protection that if this GREAT program is used in one of your fixes, the residents funds will be protected, and this will not be simply a basin-wide fix. And I'm asking very selfishly for the residents of Oxnard.
So the projects, those projects were proposed by your staff and combination with others, depending on the project. There's several of them. But they will not be implemented without negotiation with the city of Oxnard and a resolution and a program adopted by Fox Canyon in terms of how they'll be recognized and how they'll be paid for if they're accruing to the benefit of the basin. So that work is yet to be done. And so that's when that will happen. There'll be plenty of time for those negotiations and discussions and agreements with the city on how the city will be represented, how the city will be, how the projects will be paid for if they're to the betterment of the basin.
Martin Gramco, Southland Sod Farms. I want to go back to a comment that Terry made because I'm still not squaring up the numbers. You say the baseline, my understanding is extraction, the average extraction in the years 2015 through 2017. And the Oxnard, when you combine the upper and lower aquifer systems for Oxnard and PV, on the slides I just added up, was 82,000 acre feet. But we know that the actual extractions in those years were closer, over 100,000 acre feet. So I guess I'm missing something, that's all.
So the discussion up here is that there's no quick answer to that. I think it's hard for us to compare numbers sitting right here. The baseline, and Peter will correct me if I'm wrong on this, the baseline production numbers that I showed you on the slides are the average 50-year production for the baseline model. Is that through, no, I think it's through Ron just asked me whether it was the 30-year sustainable period versus the full model period. But they are based on the numbers that we got initially from the agency, and those numbers were run through TAG and incorporated into the model accordingly. So squaring up your numbers with ours, we'd be happy to talk through the specific numbers, but I don't have the details of that at my fingertips tonight.
So Kim, these are your numbers, Kim, so you can probably work that out with them and give me an answer. But so can I conclude based on that guy that the extraction going forward, the sustainable, is a total of 50,600 for the UAS and the LAS? Pleasant Valley is essentially the LAS, right? So you add those up, 32 plus 7 plus 11.6 is 50,600 acre feet.
Yeah, that's the estimated average annual production. So you're right. This graph shows the average annual production for the 50-year period. And so the baseline is the baseline pumping in a drought year when no surface water is being provided through diversions from the river. If surface water is being provided, then there's less groundwater production.
So this is the groundwater production. It's kind of our endpoint, right? This is the 20-year endpoint?
This is for the whole 50-year period. So the 20 years initial where you start high, and this is the average production over the simulated 50 years.
So the 20-year endpoint's even lower.
I'm sorry?
The 20-year endpoint is even lower because we know today we're higher, and for the average to get to 50,000, the endpoint's got to be really low.
Well, the last, actually, it's not linear for the whole 50 years. And so if you think about it, the last 30 years are all at basically the same production rate. And so it's not that it's a lot lower. I mean, because 60% of what goes into the average is from the last 30 years where there's no change in the pumping rate.
All right, you're going to have to help me with that later, Kim.
So I hope I'm not muddying the waters here. Again, I think that this is the anticipated average production starting in 2040, but that you have time to get to this production.
Hi, Sophia Lee, NAFAC Exwick, and I just have a technical question. I know that the groundwater model, it's not a CWAT model, it's a mod flow model, so density-dependent conditions were not directly taken into account. You guys had your general head boundaries pretty far out, and the model was pretty heavily calibrated and checked by a number of peer reviews to validate its effectiveness. However, your minimum thresholds and your measurable objectives are, especially on the Oxnard Plain, are in areas where you would have potentially variable densities. And I think it was, I know the EPA has done studies on this, but that variable densities can impact flow and head measurements, where if you just take the transducer measurement, you have to correct it for the salinity contents and all that sort of stuff. So because those minimum thresholds were based on a model that used just freshwater densities, do you expect that those thresholds or that those objectives could change? How are you going to account for the salinity gradients, especially in those seawater intrusion zones?
The simulated heads were adjusted based on the 40-to-1 density contrast. So if the simulated head, I'm going to get this wrong, making up numbers, but if the simulated head was 3 feet, then it was adjusted up to reflect the density to make it 7 feet. And that's, I believe it's described in the GSP. If it's not, then we can add that.
Yeah, I think the extra clarification might be really helpful, specifically because the model was not based on density. I don't recall seeing that specifically in the GSP, so maybe a little bit more explanation would be useful.
It might, I can't remember exactly whether or not it's in the text of the GSP, but if it's not, it's in the United Model Report, which is an appendix to the GSP. Thank you, Terry. Terry says it's in the GSP.
Is there anyone else that hasn't had a chance to ask a question?
Yeah, Jurgen Gramco. So, looking at the reductions by aquifer system, the Oxnard lower aquifer system is currently being pumped at 29,000 acre feet, and it's dropped all the way down to 7,000 acre feet. So that is a 75% hit. No typo there.
That's not a typo.
That's not a typo. So in the Pleasant Valley Basin, which is essentially all lower aquifer, we're doing 14,000 acre feet there, and we're dropping it to 11.6, and that is only a 20% cut. So for all intents and purposes, it is the same aquifer.
Well, I'll let Peter handle this, but I'm not sure what your precise question is.
My question is, they're both lower aquifer system. Why are we cutting 75% on one side of the boundary line and 20% on the other side of the boundary line?
the effect of pumping at a greater distance from the outcrop with the ocean, the farther you are from it, the smaller impact there is. We estimated this. We did simulations where there was no cutback in Pleasant Valley, and there was a 20% cutback in Pleasant Valley, and we had the same pumping rate in Oxnard, and there was, we're interpolating in between those, those zero cutback and the 20%. And yes, there's no barrier. It's all one aquifer. It's just the more distant you are, the less impact it has on the water level elevation at the coast.
Thank you. I'm Gene West. I'm the chairman of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency, and I don't want to cut short anybody's questions, but I didn't want you to get out of here tonight without me thanking you for being here and inviting each of you to take a deep dive into these into the GSPs. I was not a fan of the Sigma process when the legislature first adopted it. I'm rarely a fan of anything the legislature does, but the significance of this process came into sharp relief just last week in an article in the Wall Street Journal about groundwater problems in India. And to make a long article very short, it's estimated that in the next 10 years, 40% of the population on the Indian subcontinent will be without groundwater. Not without high-quality groundwater, without groundwater. And 40% of that population is a greater population than the entire United States. This process, the work that we're doing, the work that the agency's doing, the work that you're helping with is critical, for the long-term sustainability of this community. And that's something we actually should thank the legislature for. We wouldn't have gone through this process without them forcing us to do it. It's been an interesting process. And again, I want to once again thank the TAG members who put in countless hours for the last 4 years to help us get to where we are today. Anybody who looked at the preliminary reports 2 years ago and the reports that we have now will see a huge difference, due in large part to so much extra work, that was done by the TAG members. Thank you all. And again, I wanted to thank Dr. Weinberger, the staff from DUDEC, Kim and the staff of the agency for all their hard work. There's a lot more work to be done. As I think Kim started the evening by saying, this is just the first step in a long process. We'll have benchmarks to meet over the next 20 years, but for the most part, looking around at the gray hair in this room, we won't be the ones measuring the success of our efforts. It'll be our children, our grandchildren, and that makes the effort worthwhile. Again, thanks very much. Make your comments, ask your questions, and we appreciate your help. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, I think that was an excellent wrap-up. Thank you so much. Again, I do want to remind you that you have the email address. You can submit questions to that email if you have more questions after tonight. Please do take a look at the comment form if you have questions about the comment form. The earlier we get those questions in, the more we can do to help you have a seamless comment submittal process. And thank you again for your time. And all right, thank you. Yes.